World War II saw many roles for the architect and planner. One of the most unusual and unknown was the need to create opportunities to disappear and hide. Each warring nation set up highly sophisticated camouflage teams that called on the visual and inventive skills of architects, landscape designers, and artists. Their purpose was to conceal sites of all scales, from an individual gun battery or bunker to large-scale factory hangars and even parts of cities. The domain was of such importance that it was among the few remaining subjects taught in architectural education, for example, by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and in Chicago. In England, Hugh Casson developed schemes to obscure hangars with real vegetation, while Hollywood set designers were hired in California to cover military bases and factories with false landscapes, including mock suburban housing. In this image, we can see a team of camouflage artists at work at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. This would be a profession for both the graphic designer artist but also the architect, because in many cases camouflage required some sort of structural element. And here you can see in these images artists painting some camouflage on the left bottom, and then on the right what you're seeing are nurses making an image of nurses making camouflage nets. So many of the artists who ended up in ghost armies took camouflage classes in the early days of the war at such places as Pratt, Cooper Union, and New York University. In fact, that was one of the pipelines by which they found their way into the 603rd Camouflage Engineers, the unit that was eventually selected to handle visual deception for the Ghost Army. In the next few images, I want to show you the Lockheed Vega plant. This was a Lockheed, of course you've heard of it, airplane manufacturer, and what they needed to do, because they were working on wartime production, making planes for the war, is they needed to hide and conceal their plant. So this particular plant, the Lockheed Vega plant, was fully hidden beneath a complete suburban recreation, replete with rubber automobiles and peaceful rural neighborhood scenes painted on the canvas. Hundreds of fake trees and shrubs were positioned to give the entire area a three-dimensional appearance. Maintaining the illusion of a neighborhood required careful timing and planning. The suburb had to show signs of life and activity. To do this, workers occasionally emerged to relocate automobiles and through hidden trapdoors in the canopy appeared to take walks on hidden catwalks and pretended to do maintenance work. And here's an image underneath the camouflage. You can see above the different textures and colors so that from the air it would look like a real landscape. This image nicely shows the scale of this effort, large enough to hide planes and, of course, their manufacturing spaces. Boeing was also involved in camouflage. It flew the first Model 299, which is the B-17 prototype, in 1935, and in order to build these, it erected Plant 2 beside Boeing Field in 1936. During the war, workers assembled almost 7,000 B-17s at the plant here in Tukwila. During the war, in order to avoid attack, Plant 2 was made to look like a residential area. And this is what we're looking at here. This is all false. It's all fake. A series of dozen square blocks was lofted 40 feet in the air, but despite looking picture perfect, so you can see kind of pristine streets, homes, yards, and trees, it was never intended for human habitation. It was a fake neighborhood. a Philly neighborhood built atop a Boeing factory, just south of downtown Seattle, and it did very well in hiding the presence of the airplane production facilities below. Just to give you a sense of the scale, the cumulative size would be about 8 football fields. And here's a nice quote of someone describing the site. Quote, "Houses, streets, and plants were assembled like stage props out of plywood, clapboard, chicken wire, and burlap, covering the plant's roof during World War II. If any Japanese bombers made it this far east, the hope was that their pilots would mistake this for a quiet residential neighborhood." Unquote. Despite the proximity of the faux overhead homes, workers from the plane plant took an entirely opposite route to get out, heading down instead of up. Secret underground tunnels to reach nearby and likewise camouflaged cafeterias, classrooms, and restrooms. Images of people on the top were merely staged for a post-construction photo and film shoot. Another very compelling example of the camouflage in World War II is the Ghost Army, which I hinted at earlier. So, in June 1944, a secret U.S. Army unit went into action in Normandy. The weapons they deployed were decidedly unusual. Hundreds of inflatable tanks and a one-of-a-kind collection of sound effect records. Their mission was to use bluff, deception, and trickery to save lives. Many were artists and architects, some of who would become famous later, including a budding fashion designer named Bill Blass. These artists and designers painted and sketched their way across Europe, creating a unique visual record of their journey. It's interesting that the story of what these men accomplished was hushed up by the Pentagon for more than 40 years. However, the Pentagon did rely on what the Ghost Army termed awesomely, quote, atmosphere, creating the overall impression of an omnipresent military force. And this is how it worked. Soldiers in the Ghost Army pretended to be members of fellow units that were actually deployed elsewhere, and they sewed divisional patches on their uniforms and painting other units' insignia on their vehicles. The Army would dispatch a few of its members to drive canvas-covered trucks, sometimes as few as 2 of these trucks, in looping convoys that would create the impression of an entire infantry unit being transported. As one of the Ghost Army members said, quote, "We were told we were going to be using inflatable equipment to try and fool the Germans into thinking we were a real army, when we were in effect, I suppose, a rubber army." Unquote. So here you can see it with these fake tanks and equipment. It's all about deception and camouflage. In these images in the top right, you can see soldiers in the Ghost Army check a dummy of an inflatable plane. The role of the Ghost Army was to create confusion and to cause chaos. And they did this, of course, not only with visual trickery, these rubber tanks and other equipment, but also with what they called sonic deception. So with the help from engineers at Bell Labs, they recorded sounds of armored and infantry units onto wire recorders. These were the predecessors to tape recorders. And then they would mix these sounds together to create a sort of atmosphere that they wished to present to the enemy forces. Then, when they were on site, they would play these fake soundtracks with powerful amplifiers and speakers. And the combination of these noises was so effective that they could be heard up to 15 miles away. I'm showing you here these 2 images. These were done by some of the artists who were in the Ghost Army. And in addition to the work that they did on behalf of the United States military, they brought back these wonderful records and images of what it was like during wartime, done by the hands of true artists and designers. Moving on from camouflage now to the idea of bigness. Scale. So the trend toward bigness was evident in the industrial production, logistics, and conduct of the Second World War itself. Architectural projects expanded to the territorial scale, relating buildings to strategic networks of highways, railroads, hydroelectric facilities, and other tactical locations. Here we can see a bird's eye view of the Pentagon. With its offices for 3,200 employees, it is the largest building constructed during the war. It was built by a team of hundreds of architects. It's a massive complex, and it is not unsurprising that it was built during World War II, because there was this emphasis on building big and building better. This particular building has 17 miles of corridor, and it remains today one of the largest office buildings in the world, and has, of course, become a symbol, for better or for worse, of military might. Now, we've already seen examples of housing built during the war and to respond to war shortage. But we also see entire factory cities that were organized and built with very straightforward efficiency of assembly lines. This is Oak Ridge. It's in Tennessee, and it's the super secret site of the Manhattan Project. And it's a model of functionalist planning, with shopping malls flanked by repetitive blocks of prefabricated housing. Now, what's this project all about? Well, towards the end of World War II, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill undertook what would be one of its foundational urban design projects, creating a plan for the atom bomb city of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. For the bucolic site, SOM conceived a well-orchestrated network of roads lined with prefabricated homes, dormitories, schools, and stores. The master plan marked both an important step in the evolution of American urban planning and a catalyzing agent for the firm to think about the processes and principles of urban planning. And here you get a sense of sort of repetitive nature of the nuclear facilities here and the very strict zoning of the overall master plan. The housing was segregated according to race and class, with high-level military officials and scientists living in single-family homes, white laborers in apartment blocks, and black laborers in encampments of shacks. Another interesting example of standardized planning is in the concentration camps in Germany and elsewhere in Europe. Of course, this model of large-scale standardized planning, this is an example really where it's reached its most sadistic level, and that these death camps were often designed with as much care as the factory complexes. Every square foot at Auschwitz was carefully calculated and measured, and the 3 square feet allotted to each prisoner, 1/10 of a typical barrack at the time, could be read as a sickening perversion of the Bauhaus idea of existence minimum, right? The minimum housing requirement. This was an effort to calculate the exact amount of space needed to live a simple yet decent life. It was a kind of sadistic radicalization of the research on the minimum habitation that had been conducted under the Weimar Republic by architects in Berlin and Frankfurt, whose purpose was the large-scale production of affordable modern housing for large urban populations. The concentration camp version was compressed beyond any imaginable limits. The architects of Auschwitz were trained at the best German schools, and one of the many surprises of studying these camps is the variety of activities that were taking place within the complexes. These include chemical plants and greenhouses, as well as, of course, the infamous death camps. The greenhouses, some of which are still in operation, were used to grow chrysanthemums that are shipped across Europe. As John Louis Cohen notes in your textbook, one of the principal designers of the Auschwitz death factory, Fritz Herzl, was trained at the Bauhaus. We associate the Bauhaus with the most enlightened aspects of modern architecture. Herzl's partner in crime at Auschwitz was the all too aptly named architect August Schlachter, which means slaughterer. Their depraved SS boss, Hans Kammler, was an architect who had worked under the socially aware Berlin housing architect Paul Meeves during the Weimar period. Even though Hitler's personal hatred for the supposedly un-Germanic international style led his acolytes to reject its outward manifestations in favor of traditional sort of folk motifs, they were all too willing to retain the internal functional improvements of modernism and apply them wholeheartedly to the Nazi killing machine. In addition to the death camps, this same kind of rationalization was applied to German manufacturing facilities. I'm showing you just one image here. This is a home of the sprawling German airplane plant just on the Baltic Sea. This is where they produced V-2 rockets. You can see here it's a work camp. It's laid out in an axial plan with concrete frame brick infill structure. You'll also notice the use of very clear geometries, the oval and the rectangle. Again, very, very rational. One of the most architecturally significant of these large-scale factories is Eberhard Kuhn's Messerschmitt aircraft factory in southeastern Germany. This was built by slave labor, had an assembly line on rails integrated into its concrete structure, and was connected to the local train system, so that there would be no delay in the production to use of these planes. Alright, and this is an image of Levittown, so the post-war housing. Let's talk a little bit about the aftermath of the war, just a few snippets. So while wartime saw architects designing both defensive and offensive structures, the range of projects requiring architectural input exploded after the war, with issues of reconstruction, memorialization, and recycling war technology in the different countries of the conflict. As the end of the war was an eagerly anticipated event, many of these projects were already underway during wartime. In the United States, industries made an effort to open up markets of mass consumption to the materials and products developed during the war, notably the emergence of plastics for everyday use, and new types of furniture based on the molded and laminated plywood techniques developed by Charles and Ray Eames and others. In its 1946 exhibition, Britain Can Make It, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London similarly presented modern items for everyday use developed from military technologies and materials. What Richard Neutra would call, quote, the best residuum of wars, unquote. In this image you can see Benjamin Bowden's futuristic and streamlined bicycle design. It was first introduced at that 1946 exhibition. And of course one of the goals, if you think of the title, Britain Can Make It, was to bolster morale after the war, particularly in Britain, who had so many casualties and such extensive damage. Here are some other images from that exhibition. sort of futuristic bed, new furnishings, streamlined, a move away, of course, from that traditional sort of Victorian interior to a more refined modern sensibility, which would be more approachable given the economy post-war. And Charles and Ray Eames, I mentioned, they are among the most important American designers of the 20th century, and they're best known for their groundbreaking contributions to architecture, furniture design, industrial design, and manufacturing, and, of course, photographic arts. At the beginning of World War II, Charles and Ray proposed to the U.S. Navy the creation of a lightweight, inexpensive molded plywood leg splint that would be much lighter and more practical than the metal ones already in use. They received a contract based on a molded plywood design for which a patent was issued on May 28, 1941. The design sketch on the right, when it was renewed, shows a sculpted and functional device that is modular in form. With access to additional technological developments from the U.S. government and military, including newly developed water-resistant glues, the Eameses were able to yield and shape stronger plywood to produce the curved leg splints. With this access to military technology and manufacturing facilities, the Eames office designed machines, set up and ran their own manufacturing facilities, which allowed them as designers to perfect their technique for molding plywood. The three-dimensional ergonomic form incorporated numerous curved holes in the plywood that allowed for surface tension release in slotted curves and simultaneously allowed for practical locations to wrap bandages through and around the wood splints. Once they had perfected the form, the Eameses worked to mass-produce the leg splint. Ultimately, this wartime experience in mass production provided them the opportunity to design new shapes with new materials and technologies on a large mass scale. Through this process, the Eameses gained practical insight into design implementation. Coupled with production of approximately 5,000 wood splints, this became their first experience in mass production and would later provide the base of knowledge needed to manufacture a line of plywood furniture designs, including the iconic Eames lounge chair. And here an example of some of the chairs they designed that used laminated and bent plywood forms. Even from these few examples, it is clear that architects not only participated in the war effort, but their contributions to mass industrial production were integral to the advance of modernism, paving the way for its absolute authority in subsequent decades. In fact, the war served as an accelerator of technological innovation and production that would lead to the supremacy of modernism in architecture, unquote. This claim sees the intensification of industrial production for the war as galvanizing experimentation and advancing expertise that would radically change ways of living at the end of the war. Unpleasant as it is to contemplate, the symbiosis between war and architectural advancement was hardly exclusive to World War II. Going back to antiquity, and particularly with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, large-scale conflicts caused new means of production to be redirected toward military ends, which in turn inevitably affected manufacturing technology in peacetime. But it was the world wars that changed everything. As John Louis Cohen writes in your textbook, his new history of modernism, quote, instead of disrupting the pattern of transformation in which architecture was engaged worldwide, the first industrial war in history, World War I, had the opposite effect by accelerating modernization. And as we've seen in this lecture, World War II continued that same trajectory. The examples we've seen are so varied. Some are expressions of idealism, others of incredible cynicism and savagery. What is haunting about this material is not just how much creative energy was devoted to building the infrastructure for war, but how the mentality of war eventually seeped into every corner of society and remained there long after the war was over. The drive toward standardization was echoed in the conformity of Cold War-era planning strategies. And the decentralization of cities proposed by planners, worried that they were easy targets for bombers, continued on a much larger scale as suburban sprawl.